My name's Eddie, but everyone calls me Big Ed. I've been driving buses through the mean streets of Seattle for nearly 17 years. At 6'4" and a former linebacker, I've always carried myself with confidence. People notice me. They notice the shine of my skin from the body oil I like to wear, even if they grumble about the scent. I hear the complaints, but honestly, I enjoy it. It's like leaving a piece of me wherever I've been. It started on the E-line, my regular route. That route is no joke, a rolling theater of crime, chaos, and desperation. But you get used to it. You learn to tune out the screams, the fights, and the faint scent of fentanyl smoke wafting through the air. That's why, when I first met Sophia, I didn't think much of it. She was polite, petite, maybe 5'2", with warm brown eyes and a smile that felt out of place among the usual crowd. She worked as a paralegal downtown, or so she told me. She'd catch my bus every morning and every evening, sitting near the front and always making a point to say hello. At first, it was flattering. "Good morning, Eddie," she'd say, her smile so bright it almost made the rain outside seem less miserable. "Morning, Sophia," I'd reply, keeping it friendly but professional. Over time, she started lingering when the bus wasn't too busy, asking about my day, telling me about hers. I'll admit, I flirted back a little. Nothing serious, just enough to make the monotony of the job a little more interesting. Then it started getting weird. It was subtle at first. Sophia began timing her rides so she'd always be on my shift. Morning, noon, or night, there she was. She started bringing me coffee. "I figured you could use a pick-me-up," she said one evening, handing me a cup. "Thanks," I said, a bit wary, but still polite. Who doesn't like free coffee? Then she started asking personal questions, too personal. "Do you live alone, Eddie? You ever get lonely? Do you think about me when you're driving?" I laughed it off, steering the conversation away, but something about the way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Her eyes weren't warm anymore. They were intense. Over the next few months, Sophia escalated. She'd wait for me outside the bus garage at the end of my shift. She started showing up at places I frequented, like the gym or at Trader Joe's. One night, after my shift, I found a note on my windshield. "You can't ignore me, Eddie. We're meant to be together." That's when I knew I was in trouble. I reported her to Metro, but what could they do? She wasn't breaking any laws, just riding the bus. The security cameras caught her handing me coffee and chatting, nothing that screamed stalker. They told me to document everything, but that didn't help me sleep any better at night. Then things turned dark. One evening, as I was driving through Aurora, I noticed a car tailing the bus. Every stop, it idled behind us, headlights glaring like a predator, watching its prey. When my shift ended and I pulled into the garage, the car parked across the street. It was Sophia. I confronted her that night, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the anger bubbling under my skin. "Sophia, this has to stop. You're scaring me." Her face twisted into something I can only describe as pure madness. "You don't mean that, Eddie. You love me. You just don't know it yet." I stepped back, feeling the weight of her words sink in. This wasn't infatuation. This was obsession. The next morning, my supervisor pulled me into his office. Someone had filed a complaint against me. Sophia claimed I'd been harassing her. She even had photos of me talking to female passengers, completely innocent interactions, twisted to make it look like I was some kind of predator. I was put on leave while they investigated. My job, my livelihood, was hanging by a thread, all because of her lies. But she wasn't done. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. I bolted out of bed and found my living room window smashed. Lying on the floor was a brick with a note attached. If I can't have you, no one can. My hand shook as I called the police. They took a report, but with no cameras and no witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. I started sleeping with a bat next to my bed. The final straw came 6 months into this nightmare. I was driving late one night when Sophia boarded the bus. She didn't say a word, just sat in the front seat, staring at me. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hands clutching a purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. I tried to ignore her, focusing on the road, but halfway through the route, she stood up and walked to the driver's cabin. "I need to talk to you, Eddie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Sit down, Sophia," I said firmly, keeping my eyes on the road. She reached into her purse, and for a split second, I thought she was pulling out a weapon. My heart raced, adrenaline surging through my veins. Instead, she held up a photograph. It was me, sleeping in my bed. "How did you—" I started, but she cut me off. "I told you, Eddie, we're meant to be together. You belong to me." I slammed on the brakes, throwing her off balance. "Get off the bus!" I roared, my voice echoing through the empty vehicle. Sophia stumbled, but didn't leave. She just smiled, a twisted, chilling grin. "This isn't over," she said, before stepping off into the rainy night. I didn't sleep for days. The police finally got involved when I showed them the photo. Turns out, Sophia had been breaking into my apartment for months. She had a whole shrine dedicated to me. Photos, personal items she'd stolen, even one of my old bus uniforms. She was arrested, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes on me, even after she was gone. I learned a hard lesson through all this. Flirting, being friendly. It might seem harmless, but you never know who you're dealing with. Some people can take it too far, and the consequences can be terrifying. Now, I keep my head down, and my interactions strictly professional. The streets of Seattle are dangerous enough without inviting trouble. And me, I've got enough nightmares to last a lifetime. The stiff cold air at Aurora Village Transit Center seemed sharper than usual that morning, biting through my coat and settling in my bones. I stood near the platform, scrolling through my phone, the soft hum of the bus engines filling the air. The regulars were scattered about, a woman in her 40s clutching her purse like it held secrets, a guy in a beanie pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, and a teenage couple who couldn't keep their hands off each other. I glanced up, and that's when I saw him. Tall, athletic, and wearing a navy blue jacket with patches on the shoulders, the kind of thing a cop or security guard might wear. He leaned against a post on the far side of the platform, his hood up, face partially obscured by shadow. But his eyes, cold, dark, and unblinking, were locked onto me. I shifted, trying to pretend I hadn't noticed. It wasn't unusual for people to stare, right? Maybe he was zoning out. Maybe I reminded him of someone. Still, when the E-line finally screeched into the station, I made sure to sit in the middle of the bus, a safe distance from the back where he boarded. He didn't just disappear, like I'd hoped. For weeks I'd see him at the transit center, in the same spot, wearing the same expressionless mask. At first, he kept his distance, but it didn't take long before he started sitting closer. One evening, as I stepped off at my stop, I saw him follow. At first, I tried to ignore it. People got off at the same stop all the time. I wasn't the only one living in this neighborhood. But when I turned onto my street and glanced back, there he was, matching my pace from just a few yards behind. My heart thudded in my chest as I darted into a convenience store, pretending to browse the snacks while I peeked out the window. He stood across the street, staring directly at the store's entrance. I stayed inside for nearly 20 minutes, pacing the aisles, pretending to read labels. When I finally mustered the courage to leave, he was gone. I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone, I thought. Maybe I'm being paranoid. But then the note started. One morning, I found a slip of paper tucked into the outer pocket of my backpack. "We see you." My stomach flipped. It was short, cryptic, and terrifying. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone slipped it in, by mistake, or maybe it was a stupid prank. But a few days later, another note appeared, this time inside my jacket pocket. "You can't hide." I couldn't figure out how it got there. My jacket had been on my chair at work all day, and the office was secure. It wasn't just the notes. Strange things started happening in my apartment. One night, I came home to find my front door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but a framed photo of me and Sarah had been moved from my coffee table to the floor. Another time, I found a cigarette butt on my kitchen counter. I didn't smoke, and I lived alone. I told Sarah about it, expecting her to freak out, but she just shrugged. "Maybe you forgot to lock the door," she said. "And the cigarette? You probably tracked it in without noticing." I couldn't explain why her nonchalance infuriated me. "Sarah, someone is messing with me. This isn't random." She sighed, swirling her wine. "Finny, you've always been a little too observant. Maybe you're connecting dots that aren't there." Her words stayed with me, even though I didn't want them to. Was I imagining things? Then there was the night I saw him at my window. It was raining, and the sound of water hitting the glass made it hard to focus on anything else. I was sitting on the couch, half watching TV, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze. A figure stood outside, just beyond the glow of the streetlight. He didn't move, didn't try to get closer. He just stood there, a dark silhouette in the downpour. It was him, I could feel it. I called the police, my hands trembling as I explained what was happening. When they arrived, they found no one outside. "There's no sign of forced entry," one of the officers said. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" I wanted to scream. The stalking became relentless. I started noticing him not just at the transit center or on the bus, but everywhere. At the grocery store, standing 2 aisles over. At my gym, sitting on a bench near the treadmills. Even outside my office, leaning casually against the bike racks. And he wasn't alone anymore. There were others now, men dressed similarly, always in the periphery, always watching. I'd hear them murmuring to each other on the bus, their voices too low to make out the words, but clear enough to send shivers down my spine. One night, as I was heading home, I saw 2 of them waiting at my stop. My chest tightened as the bus pulled up, and I debated staying on, but they didn't get on. Instead, they just stood there, staring as the bus drove away. When I got off a few stops later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Smart move. I didn't sleep that night. The final straw came a few weeks later. It was late, and the bus was almost empty. As it rumbled along Aurora Avenue, I noticed that the lights flickered briefly. Then the bus stopped. The driver called out, "We're having mechanical issues. Gonna be a few minutes." I sat there, heart pounding, as I realized I was the only passenger left. That's when I saw him. He was standing outside, just beyond the fogged-up window, staring at me. Behind him, 3 more men emerged from the shadows. I bolted out the back door and ran, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment, every door locked and bolted. The next morning, I woke up in a hospital bed. Sarah was there, her face pale and tear-streaked. "You had another episode," she said softly. "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "They're following me. They left notes, broke into my apartment." "Vinny, none of that happened," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "You've been struggling. The doctors explained it. You have schizophrenia." I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "No," I whispered. It was real. But even as I said it, a part of me knew she was right. The therapy and medication helped. The shadows receded, the voices quieted, and the men disappeared. But even now, when I ride the E-line, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, because sometimes, just for a second, I think I see him, standing in the shadows, watching me. And I still wonder, what if they were real? I never imagined my life would spiral into a nightmare over something as routine as riding the bus. It began on a chilly evening in October when I boarded the E-line after work. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet cement and exhaust fumes. I had just scrolled through a few TikToks about mom hacks when I noticed him for the first time. A massive man at the back of the bus. He was impossible to miss. 6'5", broad-shouldered, with an old black Raiders beanie pulled low over his greasy hair. His eyes were dark and beady looking. They were fixed directly on me. I pretended not to notice and stared at my phone. But as the bus jolted forward, I could feel his stare, like something crawling on my skin. I chalked it up to paranoia and got off at my usual stop. The wind howled as I hurried down the dimly lit street to my apartment. My husband, David, greeted me with his bear-like hug, and my twin baby girls giggled in their high chairs. The warmth of my home washed away my unease. I didn't think about the man again, at least not that night. The second time I saw him was a week later. Same bus, same seat at the back, same unnerving stare. This time, he followed me off the bus. My heart raced as I turned the corner toward my apartment. I stopped in front of a brightly lit convenience store, pretending to fumble for something in my bag. He kept walking, his uneven gait fading into the darkness. I didn't tell David. I didn't want to seem paranoid or weak. Over the next few weeks, his presence became routine. I would see him on the bus, always staring, never saying a word. Sometimes, he would follow me, always keeping his distance, but never far enough for me to feel safe. I started taking different routes home, but it didn't matter. He always found me. One night, he escalated. I was alone at the bus stop after a late shift, scrolling through TikTok to pass the time. The street was eerily quiet. I felt a presence behind me and turned to see him standing just a few feet away. "You're beautiful," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. I froze. My throat tightened as I muttered, "Please, leave me alone." He smiled, a crooked, yellow-toothed grin, and said nothing. The bus arrived, and I jumped on without looking back. By December, my life was unraveling. I barely slept. Every shadow outside my window felt like him. I stopped riding the E-line and began taking lifts to work, draining our savings. But even then, he found ways to torment me. One morning, I discovered a single black Raiders beanie lying on my doorstep. My husband, David, dismissed it as a coincidence. "Babe, I'll handle it if I see him," he said, his strong arms pulling me into a hug. But I knew it wasn't a coincidence. On Christmas Eve, he crossed the final line. I was walking home with a bag of last-minute gifts, when I felt a hand clamp down on my shoulder. I screamed and whirled around. It was him. "You can't ignore me forever, Sandra," he said, his beady eyes glinting in the faint glow of a streetlight. "How do you know my name?" I whispered, trembling. He leaned in close, the stench of stale sweat and cigarettes overwhelming me. "I know everything about you, your husband, your kids, even your favorite TikToks." I ran. I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment, locking every door and window. David finally believed me. He stayed home from work to keep watch, and for a while, things seemed calm, but the peace didn't last. The twist came 3 weeks later. I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check the closet." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The twins were napping in the next room, and David was at the gym. My hand shook as I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and crept to the hallway closet. The door creaked open. Inside was a single black Raiders beanie. I screamed as David burst through the door, his face pale. "Sandra, what's wrong?" I showed him the beanie, tears streaming down my face. His expression darkened. "I'll end this," he growled. The police were called. They found no signs of forced entry, but I knew he had been there. Weeks passed without incident, but the damage was done. I quit my job, stopped taking the bus, and rarely left the house. Then one night, David came home late from work. He smelled of cigarettes, a scent he despised. I stared at him, my heart sinking. "Where were you?" I asked. He avoided my gaze. "Just out." That night, as he slept, I found a black Raiders beanie hidden in the trunk of his car. The man stalking me wasn't a stranger. It was my husband's brother, a man I never knew existed. David confessed everything. His brother had been in and out of prison, mentally unstable, and obsessed with me. David thought he could scare him off without involving the police, but he underestimated how far his brother would go. I left David the next day. The twins and I live in a small apartment now, far from the E-line. I sleep with the lights on and keep a bat on my bed. The nightmares haven't stopped, but I'm learning to live again. And I never ride the bus, ever.